Owen Calloway fired Glenn Marsh on a Tuesday morning in front of 43 employees, and he didn't even have the decency to do it in private. Glenn had worked at Calloway Precision Manufacturing in Thunder Bay for 11 years. He was the kind of man who arrived early and left late and never once asked for recognition, because he didn't think it was the kind of thing you asked for. He kept his tools organized in the same drawer order he'd learned from his father. He remembered the torque specifications for equipment that hadn't been in production for 6 years. He was the person the floor supervisors called when something couldn't be diagnosed and couldn't wait. None of that mattered on that Tuesday. He walked in 22 minutes late, which he had never done before, not in 11 years, not once. Owen Calloway was standing near the main bay doors, speaking with a procurement officer from their largest client account. Glenn came through the side entrance with his jacket still on, his keys in his hand, and Owen looked at him the way you look at something that has disappointed you so thoroughly that disappointment no longer covers it. "Marsh." That was all he said. Glenn stopped. "You're aware of what time it is?" Glenn said yes. He said there had been a situation with his daughter, and he could explain. Owen Calloway did not ask him to explain. He told the procurement officer it would be one moment, and then he turned back to Glenn and told him to gather his personal belongings from his locker and leave his access badge at the front desk. He said it in the same tone a person uses when they are reading from a document they've already signed. The floor had gone quiet, not the dramatic, performative quiet of people pretending not to watch. The actual quiet of people who have stopped moving because they are not sure what is happening, but they know it is serious. Glenn didn't argue. He nodded once. He said, "Understood," and he went to his locker and he took out the photograph of his daughter and the small wrench his wife had given him the year before she died, and he put them in his jacket pocket, and he handed his badge to Diane at the front desk, and he walked out into the November cold. Nobody stopped him. His daughter's name was Pearl. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and on Monday night she had woken up at 11:45 with a fever of 103.2. Glenn had sat with her through the worst of it, the cold cloth on her forehead, the glass of water she kept saying she didn't want, and then drinking when he held it out. The fever broke around 4 in the morning. She fell back asleep with her hand loosely curled around his wrist. He sat there until 5, watching her breathe, measuring the steady rise and fall of her chest, the way a person measures the things they cannot afford to lose. His neighbor, an older woman named Dottie, who had watched Pearl occasionally since his wife passed, was supposed to be there by 6:15 so Glenn could get to work for his 7 o'clock shift. Dottie arrived at 6:48. Her car hadn't started. She'd had to call her son-in-law, and she was sorry. She was so sorry. She knew he needed to be somewhere. Glenn drove to work doing 5 over the limit the whole way, and got there at 7:22. He had not called ahead. This was the thing he would think about later, in the particular way that people reconstruct decisions. That changed everything. He had not called because his hands had been occupied, because Pearl had been crying when he left and he'd been focused on getting out the door without making it worse, and because he had worked 11 years without a single incident, and he had assumed, without consciously assuming it, that 11 years bought him the grace of one bad morning. It did not. The thing about Glenn Marsh that most people at Calloway Precision didn't know was that he had spent the previous Saturday and most of Sunday in the basement workshop of Owen Calloway's house. Owen Calloway owned a 1971 Porsche 911 that had belonged to his father. It was not a vehicle he drove. It was a vehicle he kept, the way people keep certain things, not because of what they do, but because of what they mean. The car had been his father's, before the company was the company, before Owen was Owen Calloway the owner, and not just Owen the man who inherited the building and the debt and the reputation and tried to do something with it. The 911 had developed an issue with the fuel delivery system that 2 different mechanics in Thunder Bay had looked at, and neither had been willing to commit to a diagnosis. The second mechanic had told Owen it might need to go to a specialist in Sudbury, which was a 4-hour drive and would take weeks to schedule. Owen's personal assistant had mentioned it to the floor manager, a man named Warren Beaulieu, and Warren had mentioned it to Glenn the way you mention something when you're hoping for an answer you can pass back up. Glenn said he'd take a look if Owen wanted. Warren passed it along. Owen said yes. Glenn had not charged for any of it. He'd driven his own vehicle to Owen's house on Saturday morning, with his tools in the back and Pearl in the passenger seat with her book and her apple slices. And he'd worked on that car while Pearl sat on a folding chair in the corner of the workshop reading to herself. He'd found the problem by noon, a deteriorated fuel line junction that had been causing intermittent pressure loss in the delivery rail. He'd sourced a compatible replacement part through a contact in Winnipeg, paid for it himself, driven back on Sunday afternoon to finish the work, and by Sunday evening the 911 was running as cleanly as a 40-year-old car is capable of running. He had not told Owen Calloway the details. He had told Warren the car was done, and Warren said he'd pass it along. He had not invoiced for parts or time because that had not felt like the nature of the situation. He had done it because someone had asked and because he could, and because that is the kind of man Glenn Marsh was. Warren Beaulieu had not yet passed it along by Tuesday morning. Warren heard what happened from Diane at the front desk, who had seen Glenn's face when he handed over his badge, and who was the kind of person who kept a precise account of things because she believed someone ought to. Warren found Owen Calloway in the second-floor office at 11 o'clock. He said, "I need to tell you something about Glenn Marsh." Owen looked up from his desk with the expression of a person who has already made a decision and does not see the value in revisiting it. Warren told him anyway. He told him about the 911. He told him about Saturday, and the sourced part, and Sunday and the fuel line junction, and Pearl sitting in the corner of the workshop with her book. He told him that Glenn had not charged anything, and had not made a production of it, and had apparently not expected anything in return. He told him that Glenn's daughter had been sick all night Monday, that the fever had broken at 4 in the morning, that Dottie's car hadn't started, that Glenn had arrived 22 minutes late after 11 years of nothing. Owen Calloway was quiet for a long time. Warren let him be quiet. Then Owen said, "Why didn't he say anything this morning?" Warren said, "I don't know. You didn't ask." Glenn was home by 9. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in his work clothes and drank it and didn't think very clearly about anything. Pearl was at school. The apartment was the particular kind of quiet that accumulates in a space when a person is in it and also not quite in it. He thought about his wife, which he did not usually let himself do in the daytime, because the daytime was for functioning. He thought about the way she used to say that things worked out for people who kept showing up. He had believed her when she said it. He still mostly believed it, in the way that you hold on to things, not because they've been proved but because the alternative is not tenable. He washed his mug. He put it back in the cabinet. He sat down again. At 2:15 his phone rang. It was Warren. Warren said, "I told him about the car." Glenn didn't say anything. Warren said, "He wants to talk to you, not on the phone, in person. Tomorrow morning if you're willing." Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll think about it." He did not call back that evening. He made dinner for Pearl and helped her with her reading, and listened to her describe, with great seriousness, a disagreement she'd had with a girl at school about whether cats or dogs were smarter. He gave the subject the full attention it deserved. He told her he thought it depended on what you were measuring. She said that was a very grown-up answer and not actually an answer at all. He laughed, which was the first time he had laughed since Tuesday morning. Before she fell asleep, she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" He said, "Yeah, Bug, I'm okay." She looked at him with her mother's eyes, and he could see she wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it go because she was 7 and she trusted him, and he thought that trust was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. He called Warren back at 9:30. He said he'd come in. Owen Calloway's office looked different when you were sitting across the desk as a guest rather than standing in the doorway as an employee waiting for instructions. Glenn noticed the photograph on the bookshelf. A man who looked like an older version of Owen, standing beside a dark green Porsche 911. The resemblance was specific, the kind that gets stronger the older you get. Owen said, "I owe you an apology." Glenn said, "You owe me an explanation first." Owen looked at him. Glenn said, "Because I don't particularly want an apology from someone who doesn't understand what they're apologizing for. If you think you're apologizing for a procedural error, we can stop here." It was the most words Glenn had said in one stretch in as long as he could remember. Owen was quiet. Then he said, "Warren told me what you did with the car." Glenn said, "I know." Owen said, "That's not why I called you back in." Glenn waited. "I called you back in because I should have asked you what happened Tuesday morning before I said a single word in front of those people. And I didn't. And I've been trying to figure out why, and the honest answer is that I saw you walk in and I was already embarrassed in front of someone I needed to impress, and I made a decision before I had any of the information I needed to make it." Glenn said nothing. "That's not the kind of owner I want to be," Owen said. "Whether it reflects well on me or not, that's the truth." Glenn looked at the photograph on the shelf. He said, "The car belonged to your father." Owen said yes. Glenn said, "The junction on the fuel rail was original. Hadn't been replaced in 50 years. You got another 20 out of it if you're careful. Don't let anyone put modern synthetic through those lines without checking the compatibility first." Owen looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want your job back?" "It wasn't quite a question," Glenn said. "I want it acknowledged, publicly, the same way you took it." Owen Calloway addressed the floor on Thursday morning. Not in the way of a prepared speech. In the way of a person who knows they have done something in front of witnesses and understands they need to account for it in front of the same witnesses. He said that he had made a decision on Tuesday without the information required to make it, and that he had been wrong, and that Glenn Marsh was returning to his position effective immediately with full compensation for the days he had missed. He said he had a personal reason to be grateful to Glenn that had nothing to do with the job, and everything to do with the kind of person Glenn was, and that he had not understood the value of what he had until he had acted like it wasn't worth understanding. He said it plainly, without drama, which was the only way it could have meant anything. The floor was quiet in the way it had been quiet on Tuesday, but differently. The Tuesday quiet had been the quiet of people holding their breath. This was the quiet of people listening to something they would remember. Diane at the front desk handed Glenn his badge back across the counter. She said, "Welcome back." She said it the way you say something when you mean it. Glenn put the badge in his shirt pocket and walked back to his station. His tools were where he'd left them. 11 years, and he'd never needed to wonder whether his tools would be where he left them. He opened the top drawer. The arrangement was the same. He got to work. What happened after that unfolded the way most true things unfold, without announcement and without a clear moment when you could say it had officially changed. Warren told Glenn, a few weeks later, that Owen had spoken to the procurement officer who had witnessed Tuesday's scene and had told him exactly what he'd told the floor. The procurement officer had apparently said it reflected well on Owen to own a mistake that directly. Owen had not told Glenn this himself, and Glenn thought he understood why. It was not the kind of thing you mention if you want it to mean something. Pearl's fever did not come back. She moved through the winter with the focused momentum of a child who has projects and opinions and no particular patience for obstacles, which Glenn considered a good sign about who she was becoming. He drove past the Calloway house once in December, not deliberately, just the route he sometimes took. The Porsche wasn't visible from the street, but the light was on in the workshop, and Glenn thought about the 40-year-old engine running clean in the winter cold, the fuel moving properly through lines that had been neglected for too long, The way a thing you love can keep working if someone takes the time to understand what's actually wrong. He didn't stop. He had somewhere to be. Pearl was waiting at home with a question about fractions that she'd already decided he was going to help her with, whether he was tired or not. And he was, but he would. He would pull out the scratch paper and find the pencil she'd lost and sit across the small kitchen table from his daughter and work through it until she understood. Not because she would remember the fractions, but because she would remember that he sat down, that he stayed, that when she needed something he was there. That was the work that mattered. He'd always known the difference. He just hadn't always had the words for it. He turned onto his street and pulled into the parking spot and sat for a moment, with the engine off, the way he did sometimes, just to feel the particular fullness of having something to go home to. Then he got out of the car and he went inside.